Welcome to this ANZOG NRCOP webinar on RegTech, the good, the bad and the seriously scary. We've got participants from all over the world at this webinar, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging First Peoples from all our countries and pay my respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands, waters and customs which enrich us all. I'm Associate Professor Rob Nichols from the UNSW Business School, and I'm an enthusiastic member and observer of NRCOP. Having facilitated an NRCOP webinar last year on the ACCC and platforms, I was really delighted to be invited for a return engagement on one of my favourite topics, the effects of technology in the regulated space. Now, it's my privilege to briefly introduce our stellar panellists for today. They're Anne Lenz, Katie Miller and Monica Sada. So, Anne, after spending 17 years with the State Environmental Regulator in Queensland, Anne Lenz now leads the Compliance and Regulatory Services branch at Brisbane City Council. She's responsible for the regulation of a diverse array of functions ranging from the built environment, environmental health and natural environment, all the way through to animal management, amenities and parking in Australia's largest local government. Welcome, Anne. Next we turn to Katie. Katie Miller is currently General Counsel and National Manager, Legal and Enforcement at AUSTRAC. She's a leading advocate and commentator on the ways technology is changing how lawyers and government work. Katie has recently co-edited The Automated State: Implications, Challenges and Opportunities for Public Law. Prior to taking the role at AUSTRAC, she was Deputy Commissioner at Victoria's Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, IBAC. Now to Monica. Former Senior Strategic Data Analyst at Insight, part of the Office of the Vice-Chancellor at Monash University, Monica Sada has spent several years working as a data scientist. She's been involved in developing predictive and diagnostic models across government, university and the hospital sectors. These are aimed at improving organisational and administrative decision making. She is primarily interested in mechanisms for bridging the gap between regulators and data scientists. Now, how are we going to do things today? Well, today's session will run along the following lines. We're going to have a very quick poll on Slido, and I can see that a number of people have already started to use the poll. So what we're trying to check is how many of our audience consider themselves to be utilising RegTech for any part of their regulatory processes. Anne is going to talk to us about an array of tech tools being employed by Brisbane City Council. All I can say is anyone in our audience happens to live there, you'd be very well advised to rush home and start complying with all of the bylaws pretty soon. Actually, as soon as this webinar finishes. Then I'm going to have a discussion with all three of our presenters about their perspectives on the potentialities for good and ill of contemporary technology as citizens as well as public servants. After which I'm going to open it up to you, our audience, to ask questions. And as I mentioned, the questions which get most upvoted are going to be the ones that get asked. So before I hand over to Anne, here's our quick Slido poll. If you missed the start, the hashtag's RegTech, RegTech, and you can find polls on the right-hand side of the screen. And the screen is sli.to. Get that wrong again. When the poll is over, and our speakers begin presenting, you can start asking questions right away. So the poll is, please choose the statement which best applies to you. My regulator makes extensive use of RegTech as part of our regulatory toolkit. My regulator makes some use of RegTech as part of our regulatory toolkit. Or my regulator makes little or no use of RegTech as part of our regulatory toolkit. So we've got about 337 attendees. I can see at the moment that a significant number have already answered the poll, and we're running pretty much 50-50 between the extensive use and some use of RegTech. And I think we're going to start to close off the poll now. Basically at extensive use of RegTech, about 46%, but climbing. Little use of RegTech, or some use of RegTech, 42%, and climbing slightly. And about 11% for the rest of you where there's little or no use of RegTech as part of the regulatory toolkit. It's an interesting mix, especially the extent to which there is already extensive use of RegTech as a regulatory toolkit part. All right, well, thank you all. Thanks for your contribution. We've got almost a third of you have contributed to the poll, and that's really useful. So I'm going to hand over now to Anne, and I'll ask Anne to start her presentation right now.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming along and having a listen in terms of some of the content we've got to share for you today. So as Rob mentioned, I'm going to start to talk a little bit today about some of the examples of where in Brisbane City Council at least, we're using regulatory technology to help us in terms of how we do our day-to-day activities in what would be, I think, many similar scenarios to what you would see in your day-to-day work. So the first thing I want to mention, and I'm going to talk predominantly in two areas, so hopefully you can see my little picture that we've made on the slide there now, is that we predominantly use RegTech in two ways. One, it's to help us where we have a really large regulated community and we're trying to understand how we might prioritise resources, particularly for proactive compliance activities. The second way we predominantly use RegTech is where we might have what we call tools of the trade. So they're a tool that we use for compliance officers to make their life a little bit easier in whatever form that might look like. So I'm going to go through some specific examples for you today, but the intent being is hopefully you can see the parallels to your own workforce, your own processes, and how very similar things could apply. It doesn't actually really matter what the content is. At the end of the day, the principles that sit underneath some of this are very consistent across the board in terms of the way that some of these tools can be used. So the first thing I'm going to talk you through is that first scenario where I talked about, which is where we have a really large area or a really large regulated community where we're trying to work out how we can prioritise our activities in a proactive sense. So I'm going to talk particularly, I've got a couple of examples on that slide, but I am going to talk particularly about dangerous dogs. So this does actually hit the media a little bit, and it doesn't, in terms of the actual subject content, you can exchange dangerous dogs with any kind of high risk issue that you might regulate across any kind of jurisdiction. So for us, where people don't look after their pets and they're of the larger variety, they can actually cause a bit of damage in the community, either to other people's pets or actually to people. So we have a range of dogs where we know because of their prior behaviour that they are regulated and they're called dangerous dogs. And then there's a variety of things we need to do for those. What we use, and we have some algorithms that help us predict the conduct or potential future non-compliance associated with those particular dogs, which then helps us prioritise the types of activities in a proactive sense that we might like to undertake. So, for example, fencing inspections, it allows us to kind of go, we're going to go and check these fences first because we think that will actually help prevent reoffending or prevent the instance of further impacts. So really the example here is focused on using technology to assist us in our risk management and prioritisation of resources. The next one I'm going to talk about is a slightly different example, and this is one of my favourites. So we actually have 2 bots currently operational in BCC. They have names, so they're called Mavis and Bbot. Mavis, they were both named by the staff. Mavis actually stands for, I'm going to probably get this wrong because there's too many letters in the acronym, but it's making administration easy or something like that. Anyway, Mavis is my favourite. So we've got them doing 2 things, and the one of these that I'm going to talk about a little bit in more detail because I think it has universal application is that for our staff, they all have mobile devices, so they all have Surface Pros. They do a range of inspections out in the field. We have staff who are entirely field-based. We also have staff who are what we call hybrids, so they spend a little bit of time in the field and a little bit of time in the office. As I think is probably the same for everyone, we try and maximise and make as efficient as possible field time. And one of the things that we always come up against is once you do your inspection is the entry or the upload of all of that information into whatever system that you are using to contain that information. So for us, which I think is, again, is probably pretty similar to other places, is that we have a system that's a bit old, a bit clunky. And so what we were having is officers sitting in the field, for example, in their car, waiting for a significant period of time while they're uploading photos and uploading inspection records and things into the system. Or alternatively, we'd have officers who would come back to the office and actually perform those tasks. So what we have now is we have a bot who we have email templates pre-populated. Instead of the officers having to actually upload anything into a system, they actually email the bot. So there's a template that sits there. They put their information into the email template. They attach their photos. They hit send. The officer emails the bot. The bot actually takes all of that information and then does the data entry component into the system. It does save us a significant amount of time, and we've been able to reallocate whole FTEs, so whole resources, onto additional tasks. They're not particularly expensive. And so once you get them up and running, there's a bit of maintenance. They have sick days, which is kind of funny. One of them sent an email recently saying that they were sick and there was someone else taking over. And there are some different things you've got to do to sort of keep them healthy. But in terms of saving of resources and allowing for reallocation and ensuring that we maximise the efficiency of our officers in the field, they are fantastic. So I'm going to skip back here now to what we often talk about internally is separating wheat from the chaff. So the example in the picture that you can see there is actually us working out which properties have pools. So one of the roles that we have is regulating pool safety and ensuring that people have the appropriate certification attached to their pool fences so we can make sure that they are safe and secure and that we don't have immersion incidents where, we have young ones falling foul of the fence and managing to get their way into the pool unattended. So it's in Brisbane, we estimate there's around about 80,000 pools, which is a lot of pools. I certainly don't have 80,000 officers checking on those pools. And so again, it's a scenario where you've got a large regulated community and you've got to try and find a way to prioritise your activities in that space. You could be just completely reactive and wait for complaints, but as we all know, that cannot be particularly effective in the long term. So what we've done is we have got a fairly high resolution aerial imagery layer, which has identified all the pool locations. We're using that to compare to our database of registered pools that have certification attached. So that sort of narrows the field for us and allows us to identify those ones that haven't done some of those procedural requirements that are required for pools, and probably as a consequence, you could say, are more likely than those who have followed the rules to potentially have issues in terms of how safe their fencing is. So it gives us an opportunity, as I said, again, to narrow things down and to not to have to deal with 80,000 pools, but to deal with a much more manageable number. The second one on the slide there, which is a pretty exciting one for me, is, and I know barking dogs, and you kind of go, really? Well, a couple of years ago, we used to get 8,000 complaints a year around barking dogs. It's a very, very popular, potentially unpopular topic. Certainly something that affects a lot of people, and when people are affected by it, it is actually a significant impost on their lives. So we used to have a lot of officers spending a lot of time listening to audio recordings. So you can imagine if we are trying to establish that a dog is barking in a particular pattern in a particular way, often to do that, we take audio recordings, which is fine, but then someone actually has to sit there and listen to them. So what we've done a couple of edits to our process and used technology in different ways. We've managed to halve the number of complaints on an ongoing basis that we get because we've improved our resolution in relation to these complaints. But the main thing that we're getting really excited about, we're trialing 2 different pieces of tech at the minute, but it's the analysis of audio files to establish the patterns of the barking and to identify particular timeframes that an officer needs to listen to for a breach. So often the dog barking is 6 minutes. So what the AI does is it listens to the recording, it separates the dog barking from every other noise, and then it sends an alert to the officer which says, go and listen to 6 minutes 57 up until 13 minutes 28, and that's where you'll hear the 6 minutes of barking. And as you can imagine, instead of an officer having to listen to 24 hours of recording, they only have to listen to potentially an hour. And so it is, again, a significant time saving. It's not establishing an offence in and of its own right. What it's doing is we are using it as a tool of trade to help the officers in the identification of the evidence. Consistent with all of the themes of what I'll talk about today, it is never a scenario where the technology does any decision making. It is always a scenario where the technology is helping us gather information to enable decision making. Similar vein, there's another couple of examples of things we've been doing in recent times around both illegal dumping and what we call mobile enforcement technology. So this is about, again, making ourselves more efficient. One of the examples in this space, which we use quite a bit, is illegal dumping. So we have known illegal dumping hotspots. Again, what we were doing historically is we were placing cameras at these hotspots. We would then have to sit there and watch an extraordinary amount of footage to identify the relevant period where the offending is occurring. Change detection is a relatively well-established kind of tool or tech, I suppose, in terms of change in imagery. So it's something that in the marketplace is kind of quite mature. So similar, the AI runs across the top of the imagery for us. It actually identifies the images that are particularly relevant in terms of the change that's occurred, and it directs the officer to watch a particular portion of the video. So again, as you can see, like it's pretty easy to go, well, you'd rather watch 15 minutes of video rather than 2 hours of video. And then finishing up for me, it's really about, well, where do we go from here? So I've talked a lot about a couple of different examples in terms of how we're using things. One of the things that's consistent across all of those items that we've spoken about is that we use what we call internally, at least, pilots, which is common sense. But what I mean is that you don't try and implement something as a complete system as a first pass. What we do is we've chosen particular little use cases, and then we've trialed the technology in those use cases. It allows us to iron out bugs. It allows us to work out whether or not this is actually something that we do want to invest in a larger scale. It actually gives you learnings for your staff, because sometimes some of the skills that you might need after you've implemented the tech might be slightly different to what you had before you started. It also, from a procurement perspective, is a lot simpler because you're trying to purchase or buy something that's quite small, and it gives you that opportunity to do that a lot quicker than if you were trying to implement something that was system-wide and quite large. I think that what the future for us is really about imagery and imagery capture. We have a lot of access to imagery already from an aerial imagery, satellite imagery, but where the future is also, you know, we have garbage trucks that drive around the city that have imagery on them. We have buses that have imagery on them. The imagery is being taken every day, and it does then make you think about, well, how could we use that? what some of the ladies will talk about on the panel later today is about, well, just because you can use something, should you actually use something? So there's a whole range of challenges in terms of how you work through where you choose to use the technology and where you don't. For us, and one of the key points that I mentioned earlier, which I just want to reiterate, is that we in no way, shape or form will ever be using technology to make decisions. All it is a tool for our officers to get their job done in a more efficient way. We always have an officer sitting there looking at the imagery, looking at it from the perspective of impartiality and going, can I establish an offence here? Am I meeting all the elements of the offence? Do these images show me what I need to be able to see to confirm that there's some kind of action that I should take? That action can come in many forms and can be, as with any other issue that we have, can be everything from no action all the way up to prosecution. The other space that we're seeing a lot of growth, and particularly with what I talked about before in terms of barking dogs, is the use of remote sensors or Internet of Things sensors. They're really small, cheap sensors that can be placed in places and locations that historically weren't possible. So particularly for things for us for noise, where we're looking for building noise, barking dogs is the other example. There are other things that we regulate from a noise perspective, is the placement of these sensors that then actually are something that, rather than us using an audio device to record where we have to go out and install and whatever, that these sensors actually form part of the environment and we can access that information at any time. There are many instances across the world where they call them smart poles as an example, where these sensors are already in place in a lot of capital cities in terms of managing a whole range of impacts. Again, the challenge with some of that is similar to what I mentioned before. Just because something's available to use, well, should you use it or can you use it, and what does that look like? So we're really doing a lot of thinking now about how we make decisions about which direction we want to take and what that looks like from an ethics perspective, a bias perspective, and a whole range of other data governance issues, and kind of getting ourselves a lot more mature in the space before we kind of embark on anything too crazy. I think that the overwhelming benefits of this for us have been efficiency. So in just about everything that we do, it means we get our job done with less resources. It doesn't necessarily change the job significantly. It hasn't changed our patterns of or our strategies of how we resolve issues, our compliance strategies, but what it does is it means we get from A to B with less time and less resources, which in the current environment is actually really, really important. All right, well, that just about wraps things up for me. So I'm going to hand back over to Rob now, I think, and we're going to do a little bit other talking of a few other things. So thank you very much for coming along and hearing from some of the things that we're doing in Brisbane City Council today.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was really interesting. And my warning before, that if you are in the Brisbane City Council, you should make sure you're compliant before the end of the day. You can understand why. And Anne's slides will also be available on the NRCOP website, along with the YouTube recording and the other resources for today, showing how responsive we are to the questions on Slido. One of the most voted up one was my stuff up. So I engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct about the results of the poll. The results are little or no use, 45%, some use, 45%, and trailing back with only 10% extensive use of RegTech. So my apologies for misleading you. So now I'm going to ask Anne, Katie and Monica to help us unpack some of the most challenging ethical dilemmas we're facing in this new technological world. And I'm going to start off by asking Katie a question. What do you think are the key issues a regulator contemplating a new tech tool needs to think about before pressing go? What's the starting point of this journey?
So Rob, thanks for the question. I think there's probably three things that regulators need to be thinking about. One is about knowing what you're proposing to do very well. The second is the role of legal advice, and the third is transparency. So just to unpack each of those, I should say I'm a lawyer by background, so I often will reach back to my legal tools and thinking when thinking about problems. And I think one that's really helpful when thinking about, what is it that your project is proposed to do, are those classic examination in chief questions. So the 5 W's: what, where, when, who and why, and the 6th one, how. We've never managed to work that into a snappy 5 W's. But, really starting off with that why question. Why do you want to use a technology tool? Why in this area? I think that's number one. And then, continuing to unpack to, well, what is it you're actually trying to achieve? What's your purpose? What are you actually going to do? What are you proposing to do with the technology, and will that replace a human? Look at things like who is going to be affected, who within the agency, but who within your regulated population is this targeting? And this is where we can get into some issues around fairness. Are you applying technology to the groups that are actually the most high risk, or are you applying it to the groups that are the easiest to regulate? Looking at where can be a very interesting one. You can look at that in terms of, which part of your process are you applying technology? A lot of Anne's examples are fantastic because they're about that information collection and analysis stage, and not so much the decision-making stage, which I think is still tricky for a lot of governments. But it can also be relevant to, where in your community, again, because some of the issues around regulation can start to trip into issues of discrimination and bias if you're targeting it in particular localities, which have got certain challenges already. And then when is a big one as well, because, I think you need to accept that a technology tool, it's not just for Christmas, it is going to change things long term. It's a change management exercise. So really give yourself that time to do the change management piece, both for your agency and your regulated community. And part of that might also be about being really honest about when are you ready to let go of the current human model and go to the full technology model. I'd really encourage a transition period, because I think even with pilots, it's really only when you put it out in the field that you start to see the full effects of a project. So that's my first and sort of biggest point. The next two are pretty straightforward and fall out of that. On the role of legal advice, I would encourage every regulator considering a technology tool to get legal advice about it. And not just legal advice about, data and data privacy and procurement and things like that, but just recognising that our laws were actually written with human public servants in mind. Humans are not the same as technology. We've got some overlap, but we are actually different. We process information differently. We do things differently. So even small changes in technology can actually affect your whole process and the legality of it. So don't assume, get advice. And then the third thing is transparency. This stuff is changing the way we do government. And while internally to the regulator, we might think that it's not that big a change or it's only a small change, but the reality is that for communities, it can sound pretty scary. It can sound pretty full on. I think presentations like Anne's are fantastic because it actually shows you where the technology is being used, and that a lot of it actually makes a lot of sense once you unpack it. But I think if people, don't get that information and just start to see lots of cameras, they start to fill in their own information. And let's face it, we never fill it in with good stories. We always fill it in with, cliches from Hollywood. So I think they'd be the 3 issues. Know your project well, get legal advice, and be transparent.
Thanks, Katie. I'm going to turn to Monica. You've recently published a piece in The Conversation on the ethical challenges of RegTech, and that's going to be on the NR Cup event website. What do you think are the main sources of ethical risk from a technical perspective, and particularly those that regulators will need to consider?
So that is a very big question, and I'm going to address one specific type of risk. It was one that Anne flagged, and I think Katie did to an extent as well, which was bias and unfair discrimination avoidance. And the main source of this that I see from a technical perspective, this is the main source, not the only source, which is that big data is often conflated with good representative data. And it's kind of this big data fundamentalism that we're seeing. And I think to understand this, we kind of need to take a step back and think about the statistics in the tools. So AI, they're just a statistical system and they're trained on some data sets. You know, it's like you train a dog on some experiences and then it gets good at some things. But within your regulated population, whether they're people, spaces, documents, you're going to have some cohorts that look a little bit different from other cohorts. And in order to avoid that bias and discrimination, you need to make sure that your tool performs as well on one cohort as it does on another. And a failure to do this can lead to huge risks and huge stuff-ups. The example that kind of always springs to mind for me is the facial recognition algorithms that we've sort of seen play out. So Google, Microsoft, and Amazon all developed these tools, and they did this in, they've sold these tools to law enforcement and immigration in the UK and the US. But it turned out that they decided to use big data, which is all the data, scraped it from all their image libraries, the internet, whatever. And then as a result, subsequent audits showed that 80% of those images were of white people and 70% were of women. So the tools were very, very good at classifying, identifying, correct with some cohorts, and just terrible, terrible error as it kind of went to, people of colour, women of colour. They were the worst at identifying Native Americans, which if you think about the issues we have in Australia with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we kind of have to factor in all of these issues. Two of the companies did go back and they changed their cohorts to make sure that it was representative, that it was good data, which didn't mean all the data. Amazon didn't do that because Jeff Bezos is going to Mars, but at least they made that move to try to improve the situation. So I think it's just embedding that statistical mindset all the time. Have a good statistician on your team and have, please just ensure that there's someone who sees representative data as absolutely critical and key from the get-go.
Okay, I think that leads to another question for Kate. So Kate, you've mentioned you're a lawyer. Many regulators don't have a tech background. They're working with data scientists and tech nerds. What are the key challenges for regulators who come from a discipline which is something other than data science, that isn't a technical discipline?
So I think the first thing to point out is that whether you are a sort of regulator, whether you identify as a lawyer, whether you identify as a sort of technologist, you have been schooled and developed in a certain way of understanding the world. And most of those domains will have, I think the thing that's quite common to regulators, lawyers and technologists is that we live in very process-driven sorts of worlds. And those processes are very efficient. It's great for efficiency. And if you're talking to someone from the same world, you can actually get to the point a lot more quickly because there's that assumed process that sits behind it. That can be a bit of a challenge when you then get together with somebody from a different process-driven domain, because you can be talking about things, you might even be using the same language. I think fairness is one that is a real, potential trap in these sorts of conversations, because you can be using the same language, but actually have very different meanings about what that looks like. So the risk of miscommunication is incredibly high. That's why it's really important at the beginning of any project to actually acknowledge that, to acknowledge that it's going to be a safe space where you can ask questions to unpack, and it's not because you don't know or you're an idiot or that, anything like that. It's actually because you want to make sure that how you use the term, how you use a particular concept is going to be understood in that way. And it also comes back to why it is so important to understand your project and what you are trying to achieve, because you need to be able to condense that down into very simple language so that you can communicate across these professional domains.
Thanks, Katie, and that leads to a question for Monica, and then I'm going to try and ask all three of you a question. So Katie's raised some key issues there, and it's some of the issues she's also raised in her book and called The Automated State. Monica, you're qualified in both law and data science. And so what sort of solutions do you recommend at that interface between regulators and tech?
Has it raised some issues? I think it definitely has. But even before solutions, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to just maintain interdisciplinary education at universities, because people do get into their own little boxes. But that interface piece is so important. We have really good principle documents around ethical AI. We have Data 61's ethical framework. You know, Katie's book is an amazing resource. There's heaps and heaps of resources, great principles. But then when it comes to operationalizing them within actual data teams and data projects, it's just like dead silence. And if you think about, okay, we've got principles guided risk management that we want. You know, how do we do this in other areas? We've been talking about OHS. We have, you know, principles-based legislation. When it comes down to, you know, the shop floor, you tailor something that's actually relevant to the work that you're doing. And that's what we really need to start doing, is looking at how we can have tools to tailor things to projects. And that might seem something like something as banal as a checklist or an audit can help address this, something that speaks to the actual components of a data science project, because there's different risks at the data collection stage, there's different risks at the you know, information storage stage, at the modeling stage, at the deployment stage, and we need to be sure that we're covering off on all of these risks. And they're not just about, and the risk is not just specific to when you make a decision. Like when you throw a dragnet over a group and you identify a certain group, and they get regulated over and over because spatially they look a certain way, you get high density, low density, you know, you get certain natural processing trends in the way people talk. It's about identifying risks at every step, not just saying, you know, a decision has a legal effect, so that's the only step I'm going to manage.
Okay, thank you. So this is a question I'm going to pose to each of you in turn, and I'm going to start with Anne. So to make sure RegTech delivers better regulation for citizens and better working lives for authorised officers and their fellow regulators, what kind of regulation is needed for regulators?
What I would say is that I don't think any of us need more regulation in our lives. And so I would go back to what Monica said around, I think education is key. And it's similar to the way that we approach behaviour change when we're trying to get people to comply. We have to have an arrangement in place where people actually understand what it is that they are doing. Yes, there's a place for regulation, as much as I might not like to admit it, but yes, there is a place for regulation when things go wrong. And there should always be that sitting there as a safety net, you know, in scenarios where we haven't followed the right principles and we've got ourselves into positions where we shouldn't be. In the same way that that sits there as a safety net, I guess, for all sorts of things across government in terms of us behaving ourselves in an ethical way, us, you know, in terms of the way that we complete our day-to-day functions from an administration perspective. There's an ombudsman that sits there that looks at all of the things that we do. And so there is safety nets that sit there for just about everything that you would do as a regulator. But as you pointed out, there really probably is a bit of a gap in this emerging space currently. In the meantime, though, because that's not something that overly I can influence other than to say that there's an appropriate role for that. In the meantime, though, I think what we do need to focus on is, as the ladies have already suggested, education really is key. And so we need to make sure that our officers and our you know, the environment, the authorising environment that we operate within actually understand some of these concerns and understand some of the challenges that we're facing. And I think the crux of that for me is that it actually challenges the resourcing mix that we need to have in the work environment. So to give you some context for me structurally, I actually have a system and analytics area. I know the head of that area is actually listening to this presentation because he just texted me about how we were going, ladies, so he's positive, so that's good. But we have actually recruited a specific skill set to assist us. We have a data scientist. I actually sat on the panel to interview the data scientists, and I've probably one of those situations where I've actually doubted my own intelligence and I've had to Google a lot of words to actually work out what the person was saying. But I think that the important thing, though, is that you actually recognise that that is actually part of the toolkit now. That is something that's a skill that we need, and you need to acknowledge that we actually don't have it And so once you kind of can get access to that sort of advice, and as Monica said, there's, Data 61 in particular has got a whole range of stuff that can actually help you in this space. Once you've got that in place, it's then actually thinking quite practically about, well, how does that intersect with our operational areas? What do our operational areas need to know? What governance do we need to have in this space? What checks and balances do we need to have in this space? This is no different to any other risk that you would manage in your environment. It's no different to how we would manage a fraud risk. We need to understand our processes, the things that might go wrong with our processes, and then have checks and balances in place to ensure that those things are looked at. It's just that we're applying it now in a slightly new context. But the underlying principle of what we all do as good public servants is actually, the same in terms of how it operates in a practical sense, I think. That's probably all I can add, I think, Rob. I'm sure one of the other ladies will fill in the gaps.
Great, thanks, Anne. Katie, what do you think?
So I think the issue of regulation of regulators, I mean, that's effectively the field of administrative law, which is my area of specialisation. I'm studying a PhD on this issue at the moment because I do think that, because of that point I made before of our legislation and our rules have really been developed with a human society in mind. I do think that we're already seeing some early warning systems that, or some flags that are indicating that our administrative law system is probably struggling a little bit to really grapple with what I call techno-administrative action. So that hybrid of, we are now a public sector that is both human and technology. And I do think there's a little bit of challenge there, in part because of the very things that technology provide as far as benefits are also the things that will ultimately challenge us. And what I mean by that is, with technology, the volume of decision making and action goes up. And I think also, so it's just the amount, but then also the amount of information that you have available is increased. So you can make more complex decisions, and you can also just do them more quickly. So that combination of high velocity and high volume, I think, is going to challenge our regulation of regulators, which is still very much based on this idea of a one-to-one model of one complainant against one agency. So we are going to need to have some improvements there in time. But in the meantime, I think let's not forget the regulators that we have at the moment. And I would say there's probably three that are key for regulators. One is ombudsman. I think they will increasingly be scrutinising the use of technology in public administration. The second is, and this is probably more relevant for the regulators that are statutory agencies and so have their own boards. I think Anne's completely right, or I think maybe Monica made this point, these are risks that need to be scrutinised and managed by the board exactly as you would occupational health and safety. So I think that regulators need to be accountable to their own boards about the use of technology. And then the third is, the body that we are ultimately all accountable to, and that is the public. So I think, again, democracy is going to play a role in this, and that's why we need to be transparent with the public about what we are doing, and also be open to hearing from the public in our communities when they're saying that there are some aspects of the use of our technology that they have concerns about.
Thanks, Katie. I like both the ex post and ex ante approach there. Monica?
I actually think that we do need to regulate the regulators. I think that needs to form a piece within the move we're seeing now towards having some sort of regulatory framework around all AI tools. So the EU have recently put forward a discussion paper, and it sort of really took on this risk-based approach that the more risky your application, the more regulation you should have, but it should be principles-based. And obviously, kind of RegTech, so allocating risk scores for enforcement, identifying areas where someone might be in violation of the law. All of those things were kind of like at the top. Second of all, I do think that, again, education is just such an important piece. I can't talk to that enough. We have some data science courses now that have incorporated ethics into it. I spoke to a colleague at Monash recently, and they're teaching a brilliant ethics course, and I actually got the data ethics checklist that I use, the Dion data ethics checklist. It's very good in all my projects, so I know that it's robust. But we really need to make sure that we bed down that piece. And just reinforcing what Katie said about like transparency, which is even before you start your project, if there's going to be a population that you're regulating, make sure you figure out how you're going to consult with them and make sure that what you're doing in relation to them is not perceived as creepy, and that'll improve your information and decision making too. So it goes both ways.
Great, thanks very much, Monica. Well, and thanks to all three of you for these great solutions. And I will say that because I teach an undergraduate data ethics course in the business school, I'm going to redo some of the solution to actually use the Dion recommendation that Monica gave me. So it's now time to look at your questions, and I can see that you've been very active on Slido during the presentation. There's still a chance. If you've missed the information, just point your browser at sli.do and enter in the hashtag RegTech. So first question, I think goes to Anne first, but I'm interested to see what other members think. So the smarts you've mentioned, have they been built from the ground up, or have you used commercial off-the-shelf solutions? And what influenced that decision?
We've actually got a bit of a mixture. So we have a slightly different procurement process around, in particular, AI and machine learning in council, which is the way that I describe it, probably in my language, is that there's a panel that's been set up historically, and the way the procurement process works is you present a problem to the panel. So you don't actually procure a specific thing. You say, this is my problem and this is what I might like to do, and can you tell me what you think and what the solution might be? We've found that quite useful, and so we've got probably now at least 3 or 4 examples of where we've used that panel quite successfully. It's also pretty low cost, and so that's an example of where you are actually not building it entirely from the ground up, but it is fairly bespoke. And so what I mean by not entirely from the ground up is, and again, I'm getting into areas that I'm by no means an expert in. I'm a lawyer by trade too, so when I start to get into data science, things get a little wobbly. But there are existing like algorithms and things that are out there that a data scientist will take and apply to your information. So they're not starting from scratch, and it's then the configuration of those models from an accuracy perspective that they sort of tinker around with. We do, though, have other examples of where we have actually gotten off-the-shelf stuff. So we have this process, again, called Better Brisbane proposals, where people can pitch ideas to us and then it allows a pilot to occur. We've actually trialling an off-the-shelf product in relation to noise analysis through that. And so that is very much off-the-shelf, limited configuration. And again, what I've said before about piloting, that's the key. We've brought it in, small pilot, we test it out, we work out whether or not it's going to work for us or not. And the key part of that is that evaluation where you really kind of look at what it does to you, what it does to your workforce, and the change management perspective around all of that as well. So it is a bit of a mixture. I think I'll go back to what Katie said earlier. You actually really do have to have in mind what it is you're trying to do. So even though with that first option where I said you may not necessarily know how you're going to do it, but you do actually have a discrete problem that you've identified that you're trying to solve. Because the other observation I would say is that there are lots of rabbit holes that you can get yourself lost in, and for days and days and days. And so unless you've got a nice tight scope and you know exactly what you're trying to do, the next stages in terms of procurement and other things can actually get really tricky. That's it from me.
Katie, without revealing how your current employer actually does everything, what do you think? Commercial off the shelf, built from the ground up, or a mix of the two?
I think Anne is completely right in Brisbane's approach. I think that the approach you take, whether you build from scratch or whether you buy off the shelf, does need to depend on your particular project and what you're trying to achieve. There will be risks and benefits associated with each of them. So I do think that it is a little bit contextual and dependent on the facts of your cases. I think that if you're looking for something that you want to dip your toe into, off the shelf can be a useful way of seeing what's possible. Equally, if you have some really bright data scientists in your organisation, sometimes a small build your own project can be a really useful proof of concept, especially if you're in a regulator where not everybody is convinced of the value of technology. So I think it's a combination of what does your project need, but also what are the resources that you have available to you already that you might be able to use to your advantage.
Great, thanks. Monica?
Oh, I have very strong views on this. I'm a big fan of open systems when it comes to RegTech. Obviously, that's separate to open data because that's people's privacy. But I think that when you have a system that's making a decision that affects people in any way, you should, as far as possible, make that available, and that should be automated in a way that's scripted and can be available to inspect by others. There's a really, really rich community of people developing amazing open source tools. We've got, some of the best forecasters in the world, actually in Australia, contributing to a package called R, which I know that you were involved in teaching, Rob. Python is also very, very amazing in the space. I think off the shelf can be okay. As the question with off the shelf is that vendor going to be transparent with you so that you can then be transparent with the community? Because if they're not going to be transparent with you, they're a snake oil merchant. You have no business dealing with them ever. There was, a case where an individual challenged in the corrections space, a risk recidivism score tool, and the algorithm sort of provider just said, no, this is commercial in confidence. We don't want to put this forward in discovery. They didn't make it available in any sort of FOI. So RegTech, you want your script, your product to be lossless, if it can be. If it can't be, just make sure your provider is going to be transparent in ways that make you and keep you accountable.
Great, thanks, Monica. It was quite interesting to note that a little while ago the BRII at the Commonwealth level was offering grants. It's dipping a toe in the water, using Katie's statement, to actually see small businesses potentially doing proof of concept of RegTech applications, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, Anne, openness. Our question is, do you consult with the community about what you're doing, or do they know they're being surveilled by Brisbane City Council?
I wouldn't say that we are surveilling people. Not my choice of language, Rob.
It's the question, the anonymous questioner.
What I would say is that it varies. So, is it secret? No, absolutely not. Do we communicate / consult with the number of Brisbane residents that we've got? All of them? No, we don't either. So it's somewhere in the middle in terms of how we share information and how we consult. Particularly where we've got regulated communities that are smaller, so it might be an industry or something like that. We definitely share there in a lot more proactive way because it's an easier communication piece. Trying to communicate to every resident in Brisbane about something is obviously something that's significantly harder. What I would also say, though, is that some of the things that we do, I'm not sure are necessarily, they probably wouldn't fit the surveillance tag, but also I think are not necessarily something that it's like, as I said before, it's a tool of the trade. So if I use the example of the barking dog audio recording, the practice in terms of what the community member is experiencing is actually no different. There's an audio recorder still being provided. There's an audio recorder being done. There's an audio recorder coming back. It's just actually our internal process about how we're reviewing that recording, which is changing. And so for those sorts of things, we don't proactively kind of communicate that process has changed, other than to say it'll be a bit quicker. Like, that's the only thing that the community will see. So it is a mixed bag. It varies, and it is something that I think over time, if we continue to expand in this space, we will actually have to set some guidance around who we consult with and on what things, because there is such a, which I think is kind of the flavour of what I tried to present earlier, there is such a variation in terms of the different tools that you can use, how you use them, when you use them, who they affect, what they change. And so all of that really does change how much you should or shouldn't consult, and how, you know, what sort of level of consultation that actually needs to be.
Yeah, perhaps if I ask the question in a nicer way, which is, do you consult on the use of decision support tools? The answer would be no, why would we? I'm going to ask a quick question for each of Katie and Monica. It was originally addressed to Anne, but I think it's an important one. Do you expect there'll be pushback from authorised officers who fear their jobs will be taken over by the machines? Katie, what do you think?
I think that in every industry where technology has been introduced, there has been a concern that we are replacing humans and that there will lead to job losses. I think we also need to acknowledge that there has been clear evidence from other sectors that the introduction of technology does create disruption in the workforce. I don't think we should shy away from that. It's a reality. I think, though, it's not the end of the conversation. If there are going to be changes to the role of an authorised officer because technology is available, then that should be consulted on and discussed as you would with any workplace change. In some respects, it can be an improvement because I think one of the common sort of benefits of technology is that it moves all of the mundane tasks to a computer, and that is supposed to then free up your humans for the things that only humans can do. Where that can be a bit challenging is if you have people who currently are largely process driven, they may have concerns about whether they have the skills and the capability to do that higher level thinking or task. And so, you know, I think being really clear about how it's going to change your workforce needs and whether there are going to be retraining opportunities, or if it is going to change the types of skill sets that are needed, which means that some skill sets that are currently very highly represented will become, you know, a bit of a minority, because you've got to make room for all these data scientists and auditors and ethicists that you might be bringing in.
Monica, very quick one.
Yeah, I think that there definitely will be some replacement, and it's a very fast-moving, volatile industry. I'm constantly afraid that I'm going to be replaced and made, you know, redundant myself. And you push something, you know, to an algorithm, whether it's kind of your metro card or your scanners, it shifts the number of people you need. And there's another risk where you also shift some of that compliance burden onto people who now are not paid, but then have to do the things and be computer literate. So it may lead to a loss of people, but you know there will probably be a need for additional assistance to help people comply and navigate. And it's a massive challenge of our time. That workforce stability is huge.
Thanks very much, Monica. And unfortunately, and it is unfortunate because we could go on for hours, I think, that's all we have time for today. And I'd like to thank each of you, Anne, Monica and Katie, for your presentations and your involvement. Thank you, audience, for your enthusiastic participation.